I was born in a small village in Shun State, Burma. Both of my parents were Burmese. My mother was Chin Zope, and my father was Shan. Though they were both Burmese, they had very different cultural backgrounds. My mother was Christian, and my father was Buddhist. I don't recall much of my early life in Burma, but I do recall hearing about my father's abuse towards my mother and his alcoholism. Despite all this, my mother was very resilient. When the Burmese military accused her of aiding a rebel soldier, she decided that she needed to flee the country with my sister and I, and so she created a plan with her sister to move us to Malaysia. I don't recall the story or the travels to Malaysia vividly. However, I remember when we got there, we were constantly living in fear, scared that the Malaysian government, would find us and we would be deported back to Burma. The military hunting my mother was the push that she needed to leave my father and Burma. Staying in Malaysia was very nerve-wracking, and so when we finally got the good news that the US has accepted us as refugees, we were ecstatic. It seemed like a dream come true. However, when we moved to the US, it was far from a dream. The IRC had helped our family start up. However, there was a difficulty as my mother did not speak any English, and she was alone with 2 young children, me being the age of 5 and my sister being 8. I recall always going with her to these houses where she would clean or babysit, and I was her translator. At 5 years old, I would have to translate to her employers. When we had an appointment, so I would have to translate to doctors. I didn't understand half of the medical terms that was being used, but I had to. My sister was in school, and I was the only one my mom had. After a year or 2 of struggling, trying to afford and work in Florida, my mom called up her sister, the same one that helped her in Malaysia, and she told us to move to Maryland, where we could be together as one big family, and that she would help take care of us. So we moved. And in July of 2010, my aunt and her family came and joined us. And for a time being, it seemed like everything was good. And then February of 2011, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. It was a rare form of cancer, and it was heart cancer. I didn't even know it was a thing. But it was really difficult. For one, my mom couldn't work anymore, so we had to move in to a 2-bedroom apartment with my aunt and family, and my aunt and her family. So it was 10 people living in a 2-bedroom. I remember the chemotherapy that my mom would always have to go. I would come home, and she would be tired. She could only mutter a few words. She couldn't talk to me as much. And then she was losing her hair. It was falling out slowly. I remember vividly, as a little girl, I loved having long hair, and my mother would always keep her hair short. And she told me the reason was because she would get migraines if it grew past her shoulders. I hated it, and I would fuss and fight over it. I would tell her, "Don't cut your hair, don't cut your hair." So one day when I came home, and the little hair she had left from the chemotherapy, she had shaved it all. And I cried, and I yelled at Mom. I said, "Why would you do that?" I was like, "How could you do that? You know I love hair." And she just looked at me, and she held me, and she said, "I'm sorry, I had to." And so as her head brushed my cheeks, I saw wounds and scars, remnants of my father's abuse. It still, after all these years, had left marks on her head. Eventually, after months and months of going back and forth with chemotherapy and radiation, we finally got the good news that my mother was cancer-free. And the next day, she was going to get her pacemaker taken out. I was so ecstatic. I remember I was running around the house trying to find a piece of paper. I couldn't find it, so I found a toilet paper and I wrote on it. And I was just learning to spell, so I wrote, "No juice, J-U-S-E, Mom." And I sat it right next to her water, and I said, "Remember this, no juice, no juice." And she said, "Okay." So I got into bed right next to her, and she always told us to pray every night before going to sleep. And so that night, I prayed really hard, and I thanked God. I said, "Thank you so much for healing my mother." Unfortunately, the next morning, I woke up to the sound of my mother collapsed at the foot of my bed. My sister and I leaped out of bed, and we ran towards her. She was seizing and incoherent. So my sister called 911, and I went around the house waking everybody else, trying to get them to help my mom. I watched as my sister had the phone beside her, and she was performing CPR. She was 12 years old, listening to this responder telling her. Finally, the ambulance came, and all the chaos that had erupted suddenly turned into silence. It was the most deafening silence ever. After that, my mom spent most of her time in the hospital. And I remember the day before she passed away, we were finally allowed to go visit her. She was in the hospice unit. And at that time, it was only 18 years and older who were allowed to in that side. But they made an exception for me and my sister. And so we go, and my mom, she's hooked up to all these wires. And my sister, she's being the older sister, she's holding her hand, and she's telling my mom, "You know, you've had a long fight. It's okay if you let go. I'll take care of my sister." I'm 5 years old. I'm wanting to yell at my sister, saying, "Why would you say that? Don't say that. Tell her to fight harder." But deep down inside, I knew my mom was tired, and it was time she had to let go. So the next day, on October 2nd, 2011, my mother passed away. After that moment, I decided, I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a doctor, and I'm going to cure patients. I'm going to help cancer patients like her. I did not take that route. My older sister, however, did. And her story is a different story. But mine, 2 years after my mother passed, I was introduced to this organization called English Kids to Kids. They were a nonprofit organization that helps Burmese refugee children bridge the education gap. And so I started off as one of their students, learning how to read and write, and I was pretty advanced for my age. And so being a part of the program, I found out that I could become a volunteer. So by 5th grade, I started shadowing. And from there, I realized this is what I wanted to do. This is my passion. This is how I can honor my mother. Instead of just becoming a doctor, I can help other refugees like us. And so in this organization, I would work as a translator, reminding me of the times I used to translate for my mother. And it made me feel so close to her. And so I thank English Kids to Kids for this opportunity. And another one was this one time we got to go on a tour to the International Rescue Committee in Baltimore. And I remember this is what solidified my choice and my career path. We went on this tour, and as we were walking around, we passed this one bulletin board. And on this bulletin board, there were different key pins, and a red pin, a yellow pin, and a green pin. A green pin represented every family that they were able to reconnect. A yellow was a family that they were waiting in process to connect. And a red pin was they were still looking for family or whatnot. And so when I saw this, I thought to myself, wow, like this is the same program that helped me and my family. I want to do this. And so from then on, I decided to work hard in school, and I got accepted into American University back in 2021, and I am my 3rd year at American University studying international relations. And this summer, I had the amazing opportunity to work as the housing and logistics intern for the IRC, which was a full circle moment. And this was all possible because of my resilient mother making the biggest sacrifice for her daughters. Thank you.